Hello, test. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Before I begin, I would just like to say my formal thanks for allowing me to share my research at this time because with the return of Marcos and Duterte, it has become increasingly difficult for individuals like myself to present this locally without the risk of inviting, let's say, unfortunate stuff will happen if I did. And having already lost my father to the misuse of COVID, I did not want to risk it. But enough about that. Today, I'm going to be talking about a tradition that I've noticed among the Philippine state and its indigenous people. Within the last few days, we've heard about how the indigenous people are being commodified, how their traditions are being resorted to simple costume, and that got me thinking, how did this tradition come to be? If you look at the image, and if you've been paying attention to the news lately, current Vice President Sara Duterte and Senator Amy Marcos are wearing, I wouldn't even call it indigenous, but faux indigenous clothing that's indicative of the Moro South and the Northern Cordillera region. And at the other half, we see a large emphasis on the tourism, specifically in international scenes of the Philippines' indigenousness. That's one half of the tradition between the Filipinos and the indigenous people. The other one is the quite horrific thing that's been going on. As we both know, both of their tyrannical fathers' regimes resorted to horrific treatment of the indigenous people. If you are familiar with Dakalinga, that's one of their elders. He used every legal way to avoid his ancestral home to be demolished to make way for a Chico Dam project. And in response, the supposed government agency monitoring indigenous peoples responded by sending the military to murder him and many others. And the ones who survived the incident were sent to a re-education camp to make sure that they weren't radicals. And in most recent years, if you've been paying attention at the south of the Philippines, many of the Lumads and their traditions were being outright terrorized. And at worst, they're even being labeled as radicals. When we look at traditions like this, I took inspiration from Dr. Eric Hobson. In his conclusion, traditions aren't necessarily invented. They're built upon something, and it's over the accretions in the years that they become unfamiliar, or they become, oh wow, that's new, that's still simple. Now, I have to ask you, and look back at the Filipino history, was there a deliberate time where indigenous people were presented differently? And at the other side of that coin, their lands were taken and used up for whatever economic gains that were possible. Only one event presents itself. As we know, in the American-era Philippines, many of the indigenous people were usually the ones not from the lowlands, but those who have resisted assimilation or were able to maintain their classic untouched civilization. They were literally used to be misrepresented throughout the United States and throughout the world to say, these are the Filipino people. And it's only through our paternalistic guide that can we guide them to prosperity. Often, this is one side of that's usually remembered. What people don't know is after these human zoos, there was also a military parade that's usually made up of indigenous Filipinos to show that it was only through the American guiding hand that the Philippines can emerge properly. Let's make one thing clear. Ferdinand Magellan's arrival to the islands that we will call the Philippines was 150 years before the official War for Independence of the United States. I'll let you guys think about that for a moment on who is actually older than who. Now, here's another thing. When it comes to communications, what the American government did, not the American people, that's a huge difference, is they did it in such a way that would manipulate people to believe that their intentions were pure and that the, quote, savage Filipinos were of needed. This is a typical sign of the national ethos of the United States at the time, which was they were turning at the American century. After they put down the insurrection of General Emilio Aguinaldo, they found themselves for the first time to be, in recent memory, the first republic to transform to have international holdings. Another thing that I've noticed, not I noticed, Dr. Anderson in his studies observed something extremely interesting in the post-war Philippines. The national book Noli Me Tangere, he realized, was translated in such a way that many elements were misrepresented. Some elements were pushed back and written in such a way that such things no longer existed. And that was around the 1960s. That translation he was talking about was the, quote, English translation by Leon Maria Guerrero. So that puts us to another perspective. By the time of martial law came, it was already known that there was a huge surge in Filipino nationalism. It was part of the decolonizing era of the time. Asian nationalism was occurring. This occurred at the backdrop of the Vietnam War, the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War, and everything else that was going on in between. Now, we know for a fact that the Marcos media was a result of shutting down many of the, quote, freest media in the world, when in fact they were just private entities either controlled by American businessmen, Filipino-oriented businessmen. Under the Marcos hand, many of these news outlets were, in their words, allowed to present what was good, what they wanted to hear. In other words, if you wanted something to be heard, if something was supposed to be heard, it was supposedly genuinely Filipino according to the Filipino government. One thing that has eluded people is the fact that Marcos also had his hand on, quote, official national history. He wanted to create a, quote, genuinely Filipino history that did not come from foreign authors, did not come from religious orders. He wanted something genuinely Filipino. And this is where we begin to see where things were occurring. There was the wave of Asian nationalism. There was a control of media and publications, and there was a madman who wanted to have his vision unfold. It's been noticed that Marcos, as a, quote, lawyer, was obsessed with legalism and justification for his actions. It was only recently that Dr. Romel Curaming of the University of Brunei, when he looked at the 4 published Tadhana projects and interviewed the ghostwriters for Marcos, many of them were young and idealistic. I'm going to give you guys a few moments to read some of the pointers here, and then I'll hit it off in a few seconds. To get back on what was said a while ago, Marcos was obsessed in making something genuinely Filipino. And with the wave of Asian nationalism, it was also in the academe. When we look at the history of recognizing indigenous people, we have to understand it isn't as old as you think. Here, Dr. Taleta Espiritu, in her work, observed that the Tadhana's ethos of now including indigenous people and Muslims from the South coincided when Marcos started changing the definitions of what it meant to be part of an indigenous culture. But if you look carefully, these laws were put in place to, quote, for the land claims, whatever that would mean. In other words, it was the government, the state, the Philippine state, who were only allowed to recognize who can be awarded an official claim to a land, who could be indigenous Filipino. Now, I need to ask all of you, is everything starting to paint the picture? Now, with full control of the media, Marcos started establishing himself, combined with the new indigenous ethos that we were bothered by the colonialism period, and things were starting to, he blended myth in history in such a way that justified that his dictatorship was the culmination And if you looked at it in religious terms, the resurrection of the Filipino spirit, hence the new lipunan, if you could believe that. And it's from this point on. Remember, the Marcos dictatorship maintained absolute control, or at least official control, of everything else that was considered genuinely Filipino. And it's here where we begin to see many of the things that are now associated with the Filipino. The barong, the jeep, the tinkling, all of this can be traced back to the early 1970s through tourism. A good example of this is the Filipino jeep. Often, it's described as the spirit of Filipino ingenuity out of design, but in truth, it's actually the result of the American mafias, and I do mean that literally. The American mafia was present in the Philippines during the 1950s and 60s. Many of them had agents in the Filipino-based military. Some of them were American businessmen like Harry Stonehill, who had businesses where American surplus would be dumped into the Philippines. In exchange, government agents would get a lot of money. So that's how the Jeep was made. Filipinos bought it for less, and without government regulation, were able to make this cheap. But through tourism, we were led to believe that it was made out of ingenuity and not Filipino corruption with American organized crime. Ew, painful. And it's here that we begin to see what's been going on. An image-building campaign was done in such a way that the past was deliberately forgotten or falsified to make people want to see a more positive image of the Philippines, regardless of what was happening to the indigenous people and to the Filipino public as a whole. And to quote Lino Broca from a different quote, he once said, "How can you talk to people like this? This is how they think. This is how they want us to be." Now, in the tradition of the American show of what was happening, we recall something that was forgotten, or at least not noticeable during the human zoos, was the military exercises done by indigenous Filipinos in new military uniform. And with that new law in place that recognized indigenous people only under the Filipino law, well, there's something that's going to happen. When we think about a culmination of all these elements, the only thing I could think of was the parade of the kasaysayan ng lahi. So many people lost their homes. Lots of people were forcibly conscripted to join in this facade. But this is where things were interesting. For the first time in, quote, Filipino history, the indigenous people, the Muslim South, were now part of the Filipino-ness, if that makes sense. They were allowed to march alongside the military, and the official history, of course, had Ferdinand and Imelda as the centerpiece, saying, quote, "We are here to return the Philippines back to normal." What's interesting about this march is that it occurred during the Miss Universe of 1974. And as Dr. Talitha Espiritu noticed a while ago, what this really meant was, we will make an image that will show that we are benign, that we have integrated the indigenous peoples far better than our former colonial masters. But what it really meant was, we are going to be a tourism hub, and we're going to rake in the money for it. And this is now where the tradition becomes more formalized. The Philippines puts great emphasis on its indigenous people, but what they do to them, again, it connects back to the law that recognizes land claims, existing claims. And if you don't fit into their plan, you will be collateral. Academics, tribal leaders, and even simple indigenous folk were met with the military's full strength just because they asked to exist. An interesting thing here is Dr. William H. Scott. He was an Episcopalian academic, and he was one of the first people to point out what the state was doing was wrong. And you know what they did to him? They put him in jail for having a book on Asian book. An interesting thing he talked about was he published a book called Igorot Resistance. He was arrested for it. And do you know what were the contents of that book? The Igorot people's resistance, not to Marcos's government, but to their historical way of being independent. And he was put in jail for that. That is how collateral the entire Philippine system was to both its academics and to the indigenous people who were trying to exist. Now, this is where things can get painful. Today, in the recent days, we've heard what the horrific things the state has done to them. And many of our good guests have explained how difficult it is to exist within this predatory system that the Philippines has created. And it's extended also now to the middlemen. Academics, clergy, and activists are always at the end point of their radicalism. They're painted as radicals. But the question is there anyone going to listen? It's unfair to what's being going on. And when people are trying to do their right to exist, what happens? The Philippine state continues this disingenuous representation where arts, dances, image will be celebrated. The people themselves will be put down, and those helping of them will be put down also. Now, it's actually dangerous. When we look at it from a standpoint, what Marcos did was create a national culture that ideally put him and his ethos to be, quote, the main Filipino thing. But if we look at it historically, because of this national culture, a lot of the Philippines' diversity is being destroyed. A while ago, it was mentioned that not everyone speaks Tagalog, and that's exactly true. There are over 8 major ethno-linguistic groups, but because of the national culture that expects us to be one homogeneous state, a lot of people are losing their diversity and indigenous existence. For those unaware, these are the Macabebe Scouts. They are of the Kapampangan people. They were essentially the last loyal fighters of Spain, and they also aided the Americans during the Philippine-American War. Once independence came, they were often decried as traitors. And to make matters worse, they were always represented as, quote, long-haired savages, not by the Americans, but by the Filipino government. But when in truth, they were actually lowland Filipinos like you, me, and some of us here. So it really shows that at the end of the day, it isn't about ideology, but rather who controls the communication. Now, there's actually a conclusion to this. Dr. Guillermo Batalla is a Mexican anthropologist. He's noticed that amongst post-colonial states, often the, quote, nation state has just simply inherited the crown of dictates who. He has argued that we should pursue profundo, which means the truth. And this simply means we have to recognize that in the pursuit of a national homogeneous state, we are at risk of losing the diversity of everyone's people. For example, he's basically saying indigeneity continues, but we have to let it continue. To quote Nick Joaquin, before 1521, we could have been anything and everything not Filipino. After 1565, we can be nothing but Filipino. So where are we now? Do we need representation? A better idea is recognition. We have to recognize that if we continue pursuing these national states, as we have done, even with Marcos's downfall and unfortunate resurgence, we are at risk of losing diversity, and the rights of indigenous people have been trampled. The question now is, how far are we going to let this go on? We have to recognize, my closing statement will be, we need a recognition, not a representation. We need to recognize what has happened, what is going on to the indigenous people, and we need to recognize that many of the things we now associate with Filipino is unfortunately rooted in the national culture that Marcos created. Thank you.